All right. Okay. Open up base camp. Open up base camp. And if you go to One Church HQ, I've made something very easy. So for today's leadership lesson, there's a book that I've been reading for a long time. And it's called Lasting Impact, 7 Powerful Conversations to Ask About Your Church. I think that's it. And so we're going to listen to part of the first chapter on audio. But again, I know you'll be feverishly wanting to take notes. So if you go to Docs and Files under Leadership Chapel on HQ, there's a book, Lasting Impact by Carey Nieuwhof or something. I can't even say this. Nieuwhof, thank you. 7 Powerful Conversations that will help your church grow. Open that. It'll connect you to Google. Is everybody doing this? I got this. Don't request access, please. Thank you. Anyone at One Church, anyone with the link? I'm just going to go that way. All right. Try it now. Restart, refresh. Give me a thumbs up if you got it or you couldn't before. Okay. I've made it easy. I wrote down the main things, so you don't have to feverishly type. You can just add all the details. You can change the words around. Hey, here's all I ask. Don't look ahead, okay? Do your best. Just listen. Be present where he's at. Don't look ahead. I did this for you, but I don't want it to be the very thing that keeps you from whatever.
If we take notes on here, does it change everybody?
Smart. So you need to copy this to your own Google Drive, or just copy it into your own notes document, okay? Copy it into your own notes document. I made more work by making less work. All right. This is kind of the introductory chapter of the book, okay? The chapter is Why Are We Not Growing Faster? I know a few of you campus pastors are asking the Lord, when and how and all that good questions about growth. The rest of us that are supporting that effort, it's just a good chapter for you. But at the end of the day, we're just trying to be who God wants us to be. And I want to hear from somebody that's in front of us that might be able to offer some wisdom to us during a pivotal season in which his church, God's church, could and should grow in this Easter season. Okay, all right? Are we ready? You may hit play.
Conversation 1. Why are we not growing faster? There's no question that...
Pause it for a second. Sorry. So here's the deal. The first 6 minutes that he's just starting it, because we have to get through this thing. It's going to go fast. He's just setting the stage. After 6 minutes, he's going to slow it down, and then we'll finish off at that speed, okay? This is so we get out of here at a halfway decent time, okay? So just deal with the first 6 minutes. It's going to be fast, all right?
Church growth is a felt need among church leaders. In fact, I meet very few church leaders who hope their church will actually decline in the next year. But before you stop...
I changed my mind. That's too fast. Please just go back and start it at...
The other 6 conversations we're going to have in this book are all tied to growth. Unhealthy churches won't grow.
1.25.
Churches that fail to release high-capacity leaders will struggle with growth. Churches that ignore the culture will always struggle, and you'll just see the pattern around growth if you look. Because growth is such a big issue, I'll cover a lot of ground in this chapter or conversation. We'll look at what to do if your church isn't growing and changes you can make to turn things around. You'll also find some thought-provoking questions to discuss with your team and to dig deeper. And finally, we'll take a serious look at what it takes to reach the unchurched and how you can be ready to do that. If you and your team want to get serious about growth, I believe these are the conversations you need to have. Now, before we get started, this subject might be a little bit sensitive. Please realize, church growth is a paradoxical subject. Many church leaders I know dismiss church growth as being less important than discipleship, or they're critical of those who they believe are over-focused on attendance. Yet, if I showed you the traffic statistics of the blog I write, you'd also see that by far, and I mean by far, the most regularly accessed subject on my blog is church attendance and growth. Quite literally, hundreds of thousands of leaders a year access the posts on growth on my blog. Seems to be the subject everybody wants to know about, but nobody really wants to talk about publicly. Church growth can also bring out a beast in some of us. We can over-focus on it, obsess on it. It can distort our perceptions of ourselves. For example, when our church is growing, it's easy to think we can do no wrong. And when our church isn't growing, it's easy to feel like we're doing nothing right. Neither is healthy. So why is growth a necessary subject around a leadership table then? Because it's related to mission. My focus is not on growth for growth's sake, but for the sake of being effective in our mission and vision of reaching people who need to know the love of Christ in their lives. I'm passionate about church growth because the world is at its best when the church is at its best. I think almost every leader around your table could agree with that. So if the subject ever becomes emotional or unhealthy when you're having this discussion, just come back to that central point. It's about the mission. And even with that clarified, let me anticipate some of the other issues you might encounter in your team discussions. Often when church growth surfaces as a subject, some leaders will inevitably ask, well, what's wrong with small churches? Why are so many people obsessed with growth? You might even have a few people go hyper-spiritual on you and start quoting scripture verses to justify why church growth is a bad thing. Understand that most of us carry an innate sensitivity about certain subjects. For example, people often say my hair is blonde, but I usually say it's red. And truthfully, it's kind of on the border. But for sure, my hair was red when I was a kid. It even came with freckles to boot, which haven't entirely gone away. So as you might appreciate, being redheaded in elementary school meant I got teased a lot. And that actually led to a schoolyard fight instigated by me in one of my not very awesome moments, at least though, as a result, kids stopped teasing me. Eventually, I grew past my sensitivity, and by the time I became an adult, I didn't mind at all saying that I had some ginger happening on my scalp. But I was sensitive about it, in the same way that people get sensitive about church growth and whether their church is growing or not, or what size their church is. I have noticed that similar defensiveness on the part of some church leaders when it comes to leading a small church or a church that's stalled out. You might find the conversation gets heated and people start to defend the status quo. For example, they might say, we focus on quality, not quantity. That's natural, but don't lose the mission in the midst of it. It's just too important. People need to be reached. The love of Jesus was designed to spill far beyond the walls of the church, not to be contained within them. And finally, please don't be cynical about growing churches. That's just too easy. Sure, there are some driven leaders who are passionate about church growth because it makes them look good. God knows the hearts of people, and just because some people might want a church to grow because of ego doesn't mean church growth is all bad. Here's what I believe. Healthy things grow. As a rule, that's true. And throughout the centuries, the mission of the church at its best has always been an outward mission focused on sharing the love Jesus has for the world with the world. That's why growth matters to me, and I guess that's probably why it matters to so many of you as well. Church growth, is it a mystery or not? So here's a question for you. How do you think churches grow? Some people would argue it really is mysterious. Maybe you just pray a lot, or you remain sincere, or perhaps it's 100% up to God to determine which churches grow and which churches don't, and there's no formula you can use to make church growth happen. They would say, that's how it is, case closed. Now, I get that, and there's some truth in that. After all, God is sovereign. Prayer matters, as sincerity does. And for sure, sometimes the people who lead growing churches are truly mystified as to why their church is growing. They can't give you specific reasons it's growing other than grace. So on the one hand, that's absolutely true. And yet sometimes you and I make life out to be more mysterious than it actually is. For example, you might ask why you keep getting speeding tickets. Why God me? Why? This isn't fair. And yet the simple truth is, you usually speed. You might ask why your friendships are so conflicted when the reality is, you gossip. You might wonder why your kids don't talk to you when, in reality, you were never around when they were young and don't really have much of a relationship with them as a result. You see, some things aren't as mysterious as we make them out to be. Take that a step further. Problems whose origins seem mysterious to us are often not that mysterious to others. So, for example, we may say we have a genetic predisposition toward gaining weight, but our coworkers saw the fifth donut. That may be the case for those of us who want our church to reach new people, but we're just puzzled by why that isn't happening. Perhaps it isn't as mysterious as we think. There are traceable patterns in stagnant and declining churches as well as in healthy, growing churches. Spotting those patterns can help you spot your strengths and weaknesses, and that's what the rest of this chapter is about. First, we'll look at patterns present in churches that aren't growing. So here's a look at 10 reasons your church isn't growing, or at least growing as quickly as you'd like. The points that follow are, frankly, a bit blunt as well as short, but you'll figure out fairly quickly which apply and which don't. While we're often the last to see what so many others see, once someone names it, we're free to deal with it. In fact, among those who take it seriously and act, progress often ensues. So here's point 1. You're in conflict. Ever been in someone's home as a guest only to have your hosts start to argue with each other? It doesn't happen very often, but the few times it's happened when I've been around has made me want to run out the door. Why would church be any different? If you're constantly bickering and arguing, why would any new people stay? It's not that Christians shouldn't have conflict, but we should be the best in the world at handling it. The New Testament is a virtual manual of conflict resolution, but so many of us, Christians, prefer gossip, non-confrontation, and dealing with anyone but the party involved. How conflicted is your church? Honestly, as long as you're conflicted, you'll have difficulty growing. Growing churches handle conflict directly, biblically, humbly, and healthily. Point 2. You're more in love with the past than you are with the future. This can be true of churches that are in love with tradition and churches that have had some amazing days recently. When leaders are more in love with the past than they are with the future, the end is near. I think a lot of churches have frozen in their favorite era. Walk into some churches, it feels like 1949, 1970, 1996, or maybe even 2005. The songs are dated, as is the approach. It's as if you've kind of unearthed a time capsule. So if your church is a museum to 1950 or even 2012, the likelihood of reaching the next generation diminishes with every passing day. Point 3, you're not that awesome to be around. Fake, judgmental, hypocritical, angry, narrow, unthinking, unkind. Those are adjectives often used to describe Christians, and sometimes, let's just be honest, they have their basis in truth. Alternatively, we all know certain people who are energizing to be around. You leave feeling better than when you came simply because you were in their presence. Unfortunately, not enough Christians today fit that description. Jesus was mesmerizing. Paul caused conflict for sure, but he had many deep relationships and incredible influence, and the early church was known for compassion and generosity. If people truly don't want to be around you, don't let the reason be because you haven't let Christ reshape your character or your social skills. Point 4. You're focused on yourself. Too many churches are simply focused on their wants, their preferences, and their perceived needs. They are self-focused organizations filled with self-focused people. It should be no surprise that outsiders never feel welcomed, valued, or included. Sadly, if a person is self-focused, we call him or her selfish. If a church is self-focused, often we just call it normal. If you want to reach people, however, you simply cannot be self-focused. After all, a life devoted to self ultimately leaves you alone. Point 5, you think culture is the enemy. If all you ever are is angry at the culture around you, how are you going to reach the people in that culture? See, Christians who expect non-Christians to act like Christians baffle me. If you treat your unchurched neighbor like an enemy, why would he ever want to be your friend? It's extremely difficult to impact people you don't actually like. Point 6, you're afraid to risk what is for the sake of what might be. Okay, let's face it. At least your church has something going for it. I'm going to make that assumption, okay? Maybe you're paying the bills, or you have more people in your church than the churches around you that have shut down. In fact, you can likely point to some programs in your church you might call a success, even if the success is only moderate, which is exactly why you're struggling with the fear that virtually all of us struggle with. You're afraid to risk what is for the sake of what might be. That only gets worse, by the way, the more successful you become. The greatest enemy of your future success is actually your current success. When you're perpetually afraid to risk what is for the sake of what might be, I think you might as well cue the funeral music now. Point 7, you can't make a decision. I think governance is a silent killer in today's churches. When your decision-making is rooted in complex bureaucracy or congregational approval for every major change, it makes decision-making difficult and courageous change almost impossible. Effective churches develop governance that is nimble, is aligned around a common mission, vision, and strategy, trusts staff to actually accomplish the mission, and finally, has minimal congregational involvement in decision-making. While that might be a surprise to some church leaders, and perhaps even heresy to some, top-heavy, interventionist boards and committees don't scale well, and they will never allow staff leaders to be as agile as they need to be to accomplish what they must accomplish. Your governance might be killing you, and if it takes you 5 layers of meetings to even decide whether that's the case, you have a very serious problem indeed. Point 8, you talk more than you act. Most church leaders love to think, and they even love to debate issues, which is great. I do too. Thoughtful leaders do that. But effective leaders add one more component. They act. Most church leaders I know, staff and boards, overthink and underact. If you acted on even a few more of your good ideas, you could possibly be twice as effective in a very short time frame. A B+ brilliantly executed plan beats an A+ plan that never gets implemented every single time. Point 9, you don't think there's anything wrong with your church. I still run into a surprising number of leaders and church members who love their church but can't figure out why no one else does. I mean, what are other people saying that you're missing? Church leaders who think there's nothing wrong with their church are on their way to soon having not much more to lead than a stalled out club for the already convinced. And finally, point 10. You're more focused on growth than you are on God. Some leaders get so jacked up about growth that they forget it's about God and his mission. Now, this is a danger every motivated leader needs to keep in mind, including myself. We are leading people to Jesus, not to ourselves or to our awesome church. Keeping the focus on Christ ensures that genuine life change happens and lasts. Okay, so maybe this is blunt and the list stings a bit, but acknowledging the truth isn't easy for anyone. However, I think being honest with yourself is the first step toward lasting change. If you're honest about where your church falls within these reasons, you'll be primed to make a meaningful change. So, where do you go next? Well, here are a few changes you can make. Change number 1, structure bigger to grow bigger. After you've honestly reviewed some of the reasons your church isn't growing or isn't growing quickly, there's still more ground to cover. Some churches begin to grow, but they simply can't keep up with the growth. The reasons, again, aren't nearly as mysterious as they are structural. In fact, what I talk about in this next section, in all likelihood, applies to about 90% of the listeners of this audiobook. Why? While most media, social and traditional, are preoccupied with megachurches and multi-site churches, the reality is that most churches in North America are actually quite small. The Barna Group reports that average Protestant church size in America today is 89 adults. That's it, 89 adults. 60% of Protestant churches have fewer than 100 adults in attendance. Only 2% of churches have more than 1,000 adults attending. So what gives? I mean, why is it that 90% of churches can't sustain growth beyond the 200 attendance mark? I promise you, in many cases, it is not desire. Most people I know want their church to reach more people. It's not a lack of prayer. Many small church leaders are incredibly faithful in prayer. It's not a lack of love. Some people in these smaller churches love people as authentically as anyone I know. And finally, it's not a lack of facility. Growth can start in the most unlikely places. So let's just assume you have a solid mission, theology, and a heart to reach people. You know why most churches still don't push past the 200 mark in attendance? It's because they organize, behave, lead, and structure themselves like small organizations. I'm going to say that one more time. It's because they organize, behave, lead, and structure themselves like small organizations. And leaders of a larger church know that. In fact, churches that have passed the 200 barrier have also realized they've had to restructure and reorganize again at 400, at 800, and at 1,000, and many times beyond that. Multi-site churches even realize that moving to 5 sites creates far more organizational complexity than it does to move from 1 to 2. If you want to grow bigger, you need to structure bigger. So take yourself out of the church world for a moment, and you'll realize you recognize this principle intuitively in many areas of life. For some reason, we've just come to erroneously believe it doesn't apply in the church. So for example, all of us know there's a world of difference between how you organize a corner store and how you organize a larger supermarket. In a corner store, mom and pop run everything. Want to talk to the CEO? She's stocking shelves. You want to see the director of marketing? Well, he's at the cash register. Mom and pop do it all, and they organize their business to stay small, which is fine if you're mom and pop and you really don't want to grow. But you cannot run a supermarket that way. You just organize differently and you govern differently. For example, you hire a produce manager and people who only stock shelves. You employ floor managers, shift managers, a general manager, and so many more. So what's the translation to the church world? What can you do to position yourself for growth? I think there are 6 moves you can make that will help. First move is rethink the pastor's role. In most congregations, the pastor is the primary caregiver. Congregations expect it, after all, and seminaries train leaders for it. But it's also, in my view, what stifles the growth potential of almost every church more than anything else. Think about it. When the pastor has to visit every sick person, do every wedding and funeral, and make regular house calls, attend every meeting, and lead every Bible study or group, he or she becomes incapable of doing almost anything else. Message preparation falls to the side, and providing organizational leadership for the future is almost out of the question. The pastoral care model of church leadership simply doesn't scale. It's somewhat ironic, actually, if you think about it. If you're a good pastoral care person, people will often love you so much that the church will grow to like 200 people, at which point the pastoral care expectations become crushing for the pastor. Inevitably, pastoral leaders with larger churches can't keep up, and they end up disappointing people when they can't get to every event anymore. Additionally, a lot of leaders simply burn out under the load. The pastoral care model creates many false and unsustainable expectations. Consequently, almost everyone, congregation and leaders, gets hurt in the process. One answer to this dilemma is to teach people to care for each other in groups. It's a model of care and leadership that goes back to Exodus 18, when Jethro confronted Moses about doing everything himself. Even Jesus adopted it, moving his disciples into groups of 70, 12, 3, and then ultimately 1, Peter. In addition to modifying the care model, there's another complicating factor. Many pastors I know are people pleasers by nature. Wanting not to disappoint people fuels conflict within leaders. So how do you deal with this? I would say, go see a counselor. Like, get on your knees. If you need to be needed, deal with it. Do whatever you need to do to get over the fear of disappointing people. Courageous leadership is like courageous parenting. Don't do what your kids want you to do. Do what you believe is best for them in the end. Eventually, many of them will thank you. And the rest, honestly, they'll probably just go to another church that isn't reaching many people either. Point 2, develop a strategy. In addition to a new structure, growing churches develop a carefully thought out strategy. Many churches today are clear on mission and vision, but what most lack is a widely shared and agreed upon strategy. See, your vision and mission answer the why and what of your organization. Your strategy is different. It answers how. And don't kid yourself, how is critical. Spend time working through your strategy. Be clear on how you will accomplish your mission, and don't rest until the mission, vision, and strategy reside deep inside every single volunteer and leader. Point 3, let leaders lead. Many small churches are not led by true leaders. Why? Well, in every church, there are people who hold the position of leadership, and then there are the people who are truly leaders who may not actually hold any position in the church at all. Maybe they got into the seat of leadership because they've been there a long time or because nobody else was willing. But holding a seat of leadership without having the gift of leadership is a recipe for stagnation and dysfunction. Consequently, one of the transitions every growing church makes involves moving people with the gift of leadership into positions of leadership. Similarly, effective churches will gently but firmly release people from positions of power when they hold titles, but they aren't advancing the mission. So how do you know who the real leaders are? Well, a few things can help. First, check to see if anybody's following them. I mean, if they're not being followed by people, they're probably not a leader. Second, look for godly people who have a track record of handling responsibility in other areas of life humbly but capably. Finally, look for people who have created momentum wherever they've gone and who possess wisdom. Then give them the job of leading the church into the future with you. If you actually have leaders leading, it will make a huge difference. Point 4, empower your volunteers. Sure, small churches may not have the budget to hire many staff, but every church has people who are more than capable of serving. Empower them. Volunteers that merely do as they are told out of a sense of duty will never contribute like those who own the mission, vision, and strategy and have been given the authority to lead. Once you have identified true leaders, and once you're clear on your mission, vision, and strategy, you simply need to release people to accomplish it. Trying to do it all yourself will burn you out, or you'll end up leaving, or you'll simply become ineffective as a leader. Empower volunteers around an aligned strategy, and you will likely begin to see progress. Point 5, stop micromanaging. We've already seen that poor governance is a stumbling block to growth. The biggest obstacle in this regard is a board that feels they need to micromanage. If you need permission every time you need to buy paper towels or repaint an office, you definitely have a governance issue. Most boards who micromanage do so because that's all they've ever known, or because there's a lack of trust. The board of an effective church will guard the mission and the vision, holding leaders accountable, empower the team to accomplish the mission and vision, and then get out of the way of day-to-day management. Point 6, simplify your programming. Most churches I know are doing too much, or at least attempting to do too many things. When I began in ministry as a seminary student, I led 3 small churches with a grand total of 45 people in attendance. You know how many elders we had? We had 18 elders between the 3 tiny churches. Overall, the church was in evening meetings 2 or 3 times a week. And we added to that numerous bake sales, bazaars, and fundraising dinners because the church had little money. Why on earth would a church that small be that busy? And why on earth would people need to meet that often? I always wondered, why don't people just tithe? Like, do you know how many cookies you need to sell to make $500? I mean, it's crazy. We eventually repurposed most of those meetings to become meetings about vision and reorganization, and then we radically cut down our ministry programming, killing some long-standing programs and replacing them with a few targeted ministries that would help us best accomplish our mission. We also cut down on the number of elders. The resulting streamlined ministry gave people a few well-chosen options rather than a large menu of random programs that led nowhere in particular, to be honest. Also, the smaller governance structure made for more agile decision-making, making for a more responsive and change-ready approach to leadership. Now, although I lead a much bigger church of 1,000 weekly attenders, I'm only out a half dozen nights a month or less, and that includes my small group nights. Activity does not equal accomplishment. Just because you're busy doesn't mean you're being effective. If you have a lot of programs that are accomplishing little and leading nowhere, stop them. Yes, people will be mad, but just muster the courage to cut some good programs because good is the enemy of great, and then go out and do a few great things. Free up your time so that you and your team can accomplish something truly significant. Structuring bigger to grow bigger is as painful and difficult as it is necessary, but it's also liberating and tremendously freeing. Sure, it may be radical, but radical problems demand radical solutions. So, there's no silver bullet? You see, somewhere in your team discussion, you'll be tempted to believe that this has just got to be simpler. You're going to have that conversation. I know you are. And maybe you'll try to convince yourself that you would really grow if you only had one or two more things that would make your ministry thrive. For example, you maybe have said any combination of these things. We would grow if we ... got out of our portable location and opened a new building, right? All we really need to do is move and then we're going to grow. Or maybe you said the opposite. If we got out of our current building and became portable. See, I've actually talked with leaders who think they would grow explosively if they left their old building and became portable like all the church plants. Or maybe you said, hey, we would grow if we added technology like lights and sound or video. Or we'd grow if we merged with another church. Or we'd grow if we just added a new campus. Well, the question is, would you? Here's my theory. Nope, you wouldn't. Before you get discouraged, let me explain why this line of thinking rarely, if ever, works. David Ogilvy, the famous 20th century advertising guru, is famous for saying that great marketing just makes a bad product fail faster. Now that stings, and it's a principle that most of us want to ignore, or at least I do, but it's true. Most churches aren't held back because of their venue or even because of their technology. They're stagnant or dying because they're not connecting with people and effectively fulfilling their mission. The trap most leaders fall into is to believe that a change in form will be an adequate substitute for a change in substance. That's a lie. A change in form never makes up for a change in substance. Substantive change is the only thing that will truly change the trajectory of most churches and most organizations. A change in venue won't help a dying church grow. Better media won't help a dying church grow. Adding new campuses won't help a dying church grow. And merging won't help 2 or 3 dying churches grow. I've lived through this tension. In less than 2 decades, our church has met in a century-old building, in an elementary school, in a brand new facility, in a movie theater, and once again, in a brand new facility. Through all phases, we've grown from a handful of people to just over 1,000 on weekends today. And throughout, buildings and technology and even locations have simply been a means to an end, not ends in themselves. They did not make us grow or reach new people. They helped, but they're not the secret sauce. Now, just because I know you're asking, how do I make things worse? Well, here's how to do it. Here's how to make things worse. Sometimes leaders can end up making the situation worse without even realizing how it happened. So in the interest of clarity, if you want to make things worse, here's how to do it. Address form, but don't address substance. Never resolve your underlying problems. Instead, just add technology, add locations, add campuses, engineer a merger, and hope all of this will magically solve all your problems. It won't. In fact, it will make them worse. Because now, instead of being in your old building with a manageable budget, you are in a new one with higher costs you can't pay. And instead of having a simple message people can understand, you have all this technology that's creating even greater distance between you and the people you're trying to reach. Instead of being in one location, you're now in 2, only to discover you now have momentum issues in 2 locations, not just one. Or if you arrange a merger, you now have 2 organizations' problems to solve. This is why church mergers in mainline churches almost never work. Church takeovers can and do, by the way. Now, I believe all these things are true. You can grow a church in a centuries-old building, and you can kill a church in a brand new multi-million-dollar facility. You can grow a church with 0 media, and you can waste $1 million on lights, gear, and cameras. You can grow a church in a single site, and you can go bankrupt adding venues no one wants to attend. Okay, these are hard truths, I know that, but they're so helpful, I think, because they make us look in the mirror and get on our knees. And they help us realize where the issue really is and make us do the homework and the heart work we really need to do. Now, please hear me. I have led church mergers and multi-site expansions and building campaigns and a portable church and rapid technological change in the church, and they've all helped us reach more people and grow our ministry. But I think it's only because we sat down and solved our underlying problems as an organization first. And as we got healthier inwardly, we grew outwardly. We tackled the issues of substance before, and we tackled them as often as possible, even as we approach the issues of form. And don't miss this. God has been incredibly gracious to us. I say that just so you know I'm not trying to take credit. And I'm sure God has been gracious to you too. It's just that God's grace is no substitute for using your mind and heart to engage the issues of leadership that are before you. For us, the whole journey started and continues actually with prayer, scripture, and a burning desire to reach people who are far from God. Then we tried to figure out a strategy to help us accomplish that. 20 years into the leadership journey for me, it still starts with prayer, scripture, and a burning desire. Now, some of you are saying, okay, but we're still not growing. Okay, so what if you've reorganized, strategized, and made substantive changes in your church, but you're still not growing? Almost every church and almost every organization faces seasons in which growth stops. Some haven't seen growth in years or maybe decades. One of the best things any leader can do when they're in a tough spot is to stop making assumptions and start asking questions. Our assumptions got us to where we are today, let's be honest, but they won't necessarily get us where we need to go. So I found 4 questions in particular are very helpful when your church stops growing. Question number 1, is our sense of mission white hot? Effective churches have a white hot sense of mission. I'm completely convinced of that. It's far more than a piece of paper on a wall or something that the board recites at annual meetings. The mission lives daily in the souls of countless people in the congregation. It motivates all of the action in the organization, and it consumes people, especially leaders. Often a church that has stopped growing has lost the urgency behind its mission. This is doubly sad in the case of a church because our mission is actually Christ's mission. It's the spreading of the gospel into the world for which Jesus died. Leaders in congregations that are effective in accomplishing their mission are consumed by their mission. It always burns white hot. Question 2. If you're stuck, try asking this one. Has our strategy or approach become dated? While the mission of the church is eternal, strategy should actually shift from generation to generation. Today, it needs to shift even more quickly than that. You may have skipped through the strategy section earlier in this conversation, this chapter, and thought, well, that's okay. We have a highly developed strategy. Well, that may be true. But is your strategy still effective? Or is it dated? Identifying a dated strategy is easy if you're a new leader who has taken over from someone else. It's much harder when you've led in a context for more than 5 years. The challenge in long-term leadership is that the changes you introduced may have been novel and effective when you introduced them, but it's not 1995 anymore, or 2005 for that matter. So how do you tell if your strategy is dated? This way. It just stops being effective. Another clue is when you see very few people in the next generation adopting the approach or the strategy you've adopted. Tomorrow's leaders tend to gravitate toward tomorrow's solutions. Make sure you understand where the next generation is headed in terms of their strategy. Better yet, get them around your leadership table. Question 3 to ask if your church isn't growing. Are we on top of the constant change in our culture? See, while you're studying your strategy, you might also want to study culture. It's changing radically and quickly. I believe when historians look back on our generation, they will see it as a crack in history. We now live in a post-Christian, postmodern world. That's very true in Canada, and it's increasingly true in the United States. In my experience, many of us in church leadership don't really grasp the enormity of the change going on around us. If you want to explore more of this conversation, Chapter 6 is dedicated to exploring the changing trends in our culture. Question number 4. If you're not growing, ask this. Are we focused on unchurched people, or are we focused on ourselves? So there's this tendency you and I have as human beings. Our natural drift is to focus on ourselves, not on Christ, not on others. The gravitational pull of any church is toward insiders, not outsiders. Left unattended, your church will become a place where the preferences of the members trump passion for the mission. Now, I think there are 2 primary ways to address this drift. First, in every decision, focus on who you want to reach, not on who you want to keep. And second, commit to losing yourself for the sake of finding others. I completely understand that people automatically respond with, well, what about me and like my needs? Or what about the needs of our faithful members who have been here for a long, long time? Jesus said something about finding your life in the process of losing it, didn't he? That's Matthew 10:39. I find this, see if you don't agree. People who focus on helping others and honoring Christ soon discover that their needs are met far more deeply than they ever experienced when they were focused on themselves. I've found that to be true. Okay, well, if you've answered those questions, then I think you might be ready to reach the unchurched. So now that the problems have been diagnosed, what are some signs, some actual signs that you're ready to reach unchurched people and ready to throw the doors open? Growing churches have often embraced the following characteristics. First, your main services engage teenagers. Okay, I've talked with a lot of church leaders who want to reach unchurched people, but they just can't understand why unchurched people don't like their question. They're stumped until I ask them one last question. And here's the question. Do the teens in your church love your services and want to invite their friends? As soon as I ask that question, a leader's expression will always change, and he or she would look down on the floor and they just kind of go, nope. Well, here's what I believe. If teenagers find your main services, yeah, and by that I mean the ones you actually run on Sunday morning in prime time, if they find them boring, irrelevant, and disengaging, so will unchurched people. As a rule, if you can design church services that engage teenagers, then you've designed a church service that engages unchurched people. Point 2, you're good with questions. This one's still hard for me. I like to think that every question has an answer, and I think one of the reasons unchurched people flee churches is that they feel shut down when every question they ask has a snappy or quick answer. They'll find answers. I mean, unchurched people will, but you just need to give them time. Embracing the questions of unchurched people is a form of embracing them. Third point, you're honest about your struggles. Unchurched people get suspicious when church leaders and Christians appear to have it, quote, all together. Let's face it, you don't, I don't, and they know it. When you're honest about your struggles, it just draws unchurched people closer. I make it a point to tell unchurched people that our church isn't perfect, that we're probably going to let them down, but that one of the marks of Christian community is that we can deal with our problems face-to-face and honestly, and I hope we'll be able to work through it. There's a very strange attraction to that. Fourth point, you have easy, obvious, strategic, and helpful steps for new people. I am still such a huge fan of steps, not programs, the very kind of strategy that Andy Stanley, Reggie Joiner, and Lane Jones talked about in their great book, The 7 Practices of Effective Ministry. One sure sign that you're ready to handle an influx of unchurched people is that your church has clear, easy, accessible pathways to move someone from their first visit right through to integration with existing Christians and small groups and other core ministries. Most churches simply have randomly assembled programs that lead nowhere in particular. So, define a strategy that moves people along a path. Point number 5, you've dumped all assumptions. It's easy to assume that unchurched people, quote, must know at least the basics of the Christian faith. Lose that thinking. How much, for example, do you really know about Hinduism or Taoism? That's about how much unchurched people really know about Christianity. Don't fight it. Don't get mad. Don't criticize them. Embrace it. Make it easy for everyone to access what you're actually talking about whenever you're talking about it. Next point. Your outreach isn't just a program. Many Christians think having a, quote, service for unchurched people or a program designed for unchurched people is enough. It's not. When you behave as reaching unchurched people can be done through a program or alternative service, you're building a giant brick wall for unchurched people to walk into. You might as well tell them, you know what, this program is for you, but our church is for us. Sorry, I don't think you want to say that. And then finally, you're flexible and adaptable. In the future, you will not arrive. I think the approach to unchurched people and the strategy behind the mission of the church needs to be flexible and adaptable. Don't design a now we're done model for reaching unchurched people. You may never be done. Churches that are adaptable and flexible in their strategy, not in their mission or vision, will have the best chance of continually reaching unchurched people. How quickly can your church change will become the defining question of future churches. So before we go, 3 causes of decline. While the causes of church stagnation and decline are complex, they essentially fall into 3 categories. Number 1, internal dysfunction that is sapping the community of its life, such as conflict, wrong people in the wrong places, unrealistic expectations of staff, board, and volunteers. So that's 1, internal dysfunction. Second, by way of summary, structural issues, such as boards that micromanage or pastoral care being vested in one pastor or a handful of leaders. And then finally, number 3, an inward focus that refuses to acknowledge the need to change to be effective with outsiders. Churches that deal with these internal issues will be in a much better position to deal with the subject of chapter 6, which is all about the cultural change that's happening around us that's making it difficult for even healthier churches to grow. Well, that's the end of the substance to our first conversation in chapter 1. Now on to the discussion questions. And these are questions that you can ask yourself, or preferably you would sit down and discuss with your team, whether that's your board of elders or staff or volunteers that you're working with. And here's what I'm going to do as a bonus.
All right. A lot of good thoughts. If you would like to listen to that again, I can make that available to you. I'll also, where my notes stopped, I'll throw up some general stuff so it's there under that master document that you can copy. Just to encourage you to think about the questions. Notice he really doesn't give you answers. He just makes you think and ask questions for our setting, for your setting. So, Lord, would you speak to us about how we can grow your church? It's for you. It's not for us. We realize that attendance growth or financial growth are just one or two of many signs of a healthy growth, a healthy growing church. Are people getting saved? Are people stepping into ministry? Are people stewarding their resources in the area of missions? There's just so many things, God. Are leaders being developed? Sometimes growth is not like a steady climb, like a hill or a mountain. Sometimes it's like stairs, where there's growth and then a plateau while you figure things out and get healthy, and that after that growth, and then growth again, and then you give us time to figure things out. And often that's just so that we don't get ahead of you and we don't get full of ourselves. And so, Lord, would you just help us to navigate the tension in this whole area, and not let it also go to our soul, that we would be insecure or feel like you're not pleased with us, because that's not the case at all either. So we just commit all this to you. In Jesus' name, amen. I love you guys. Have a great day. We'll start in 10 minutes in our next meetings.